In today's video, I want to share with you 5 things that I wish I knew when I first started using this camera, the Sony Fx30. Now, these are 5 tips that are going to help save you some time and money when you're using the camera, so let's get into it. The first thing is going to help you maximize your image quality. I would recommend using a 10-bit 422 mode and to film in S-Log3, not the S-Cinetone mode. Now, S-Cinetone is great, but if you want the maximum dynamic range and the most flexibility when it comes to color grading your image, shoot in S-Log3. Now, specifically, the thing that I think that you should do with S-Log3 in order to expose it properly is to set your zebras somewhere between 48 and let's say 55 and try to put your skin tones in that zebra pattern. If you do this, this is going to set your skin tones about a stop, maybe a stop and a half above middle gray, and it's going to set you up for success because your skin tones, depending on the complexion and where you need to expose them, are going to be just above middle gray. So your primary subject is not going to be underexposed. You're not going to have a bunch of noise that you're competing with in the most important parts of the image, but you're also not exposing to the right so much so that you lose a bunch of highlight information. This camera has a pretty good and clean sensor, and I don't think you need to expose to the right to get the best image quality possible. This next one should save you a little bit of money and quite a bit of hassle, and it's to not bother with recording in RAW externally. Now, I think it's nice that we have this feature on this camera. If you're shooting on a set with a bunch of FX3s and they're all recording in ProRes RAW, for example, it's nice to have the option to just plug into that workflow. But I've done some extensive tests on this channel, and I'll leave a link to that video for you to check out in detail. But in general, I think that the external RAW recording is pretty problematic and compromised. There is a pretty significant crop on the sensor. We only get about a 4.7K out of the 6K total resolution crop on this, so there's a decent crop on the already Super 35 size sensor, and there's no noise reduction on a raw output, and so you're going to be left with a cropped in image and a really noisy signal, and I just don't think that it's worth the hassle of having to clean that up and fight against the crop. Sure, you're going to have 12-bit color instead of 10-bit color, but I think the 10-bit color on this thing is actually quite good. And I think that you're just better off to avoid shooting in RAW unless it's absolutely necessary. The next thing that I want to share with you has to do with the top handle. And it's the fact that the top handle can both be purchased separately at another time, and also that it is interchangeable with other Sony camera bodies. So obviously you probably guessed that you can share the top handle back and forth between an Fx30 and an Fx3, but it can actually be used on other Sony mirrorless camera bodies as well. They have to be current generation cameras, so the A7S III and the A7 IV work with this, which is really nice, and it's the setup that I'm actually recording this video right now. I have an A7S III with the Fx30 top handle. That's why you don't see it on this one that I'm holding up right now. And I'm able to plug my Rode NTG2 microphone directly into the feed and record this video. So I think that adds a lot of extra value and versatility for this camera, because you could purchase this thing with the top handle, and if you're using an A7S III or an A7 IV, for example, if you have the right small rig adapter plate, which is like right around 30 bucks or so, you can swap the top handle back and forth. And so that just makes the value and versatility of this thing that much higher. The next thing that I want to share a little bit about is the Cine EI mode. Now, this is a pretty confusing topic. I've gotten a fair amount of questions both in the comment section and in person about this mode, but I want to clear up what this mode is and when I think it would make the most sense to use. Now, Cine EI is essentially a monitoring workflow tool. It's not necessarily a different mode to shoot in. If you're using Sony EI, it stands for Exposure Index. You're basically telling your monitor what ISO you want to expose for, but it's going to record at either 800 or 2500. And the reason why you would want to tell your monitor that you're exposing for potentially a different ISO than you're actually recording is because it's going to change the way that you light your scene and expose your scene. So for example, if you are filming in a really dark environment and you want to make sure that you have enough detail in your shadows, then you would set your exposure index for something a little bit lower. So instead of 2500, you might set your exposure index for 2000 or 1600. You light for that darker scene. It adds a little bit more light that is hitting your sensor because you're overcompensating with your lighting. And then when you bring it in post, you have a scene that was exposed with an ISO 2500, that second base ISO, but it was lit for something as if it was exposed for, let's say, ISO 2000 or 1600. Now, if this is really complicated, then you are in good company because it is kind of a confusing workflow tool, but it's something that gets used on the Sony Venice, on the FX9, FX6, and so it is a professional tool that has made its way down the Sony FX lineup and into this guy, and it's pretty cool to have because it means that the FX30 can fit alongside something like an FX9 or potentially even a Venice, and it can be able to use the same exposure workflow tools on set with Cine EI. If you want a little bit more of an in-depth explainer on Cine EI, I actually have a course that I've built on the Sony FX30. It's called Getting the Most Out of Your FX30, and it's something that I've released for $39 to make it relatively affordable. There is 19 video modules and over 2 hours of content on all of these topics that I've talked about in this video specifically. This course really is my way of being able to consolidate a bunch of information about the FX30 into one place that is relatively affordable to access. It also has an emphasis on how to utilize this camera and run and gun documentary scenarios. And so if any of that interests you, feel free to check it out in the description below. This last tip should save you a little bit of money and open up some different lens options for you. And it's that the Super 35 size sensor isn't a negative. There's a ton of hype on the internet about full frame cameras, and with the big brother to this camera, the FX3 being full frame, it's something that gets brought up a lot when this guy is talked about. But I honestly don't think that Super 35 is a negative in any way. Sure, it's a little bit smaller of a sensor, but it opens up a ton more flexibility when it comes to lens options. There are a ton of really good Super 35 lens options on the market, both in terms of stills options and in terms of manual cinema options. So you actually have a lot more rental options when you're using this camera over the FX3. And generally speaking, Super 35 stills lenses tend to be a lot more affordable than their full frame counterparts. The fact that this is a Super 35 sensor opens up a few more options if you're willing to use manual lenses as opposed to autofocus ones, because you can use something like a speed booster and still get a full frame field of view, or you could use something like a rear mounted variable ND filter and have a variable ND filter essentially built into the camera body. So don't let Super 35 scare you. I think that if you're aware of its strengths, then you can actually have a lot more versatility and be able to kind of lean into the strength of that format. And remember, it's not the size that matters, it's how you use it, right? Okay. Well, that is gonna do it for this one. I think that this is a fantastic camera, and I think that if you can learn to use it correctly, you can produce some fantastic images and tell some great stories. So I'm super excited to see what you guys make with this camera, and I will catch you guys in the next one.